in anything, I think you cannot accomplish anything if you run away from it. But I think if you have something to offer which can help a situation, and you feel that it is sufficiently sincere to make an impression, then I think you should do it in your own manner.
Marian Anderson is an African-American singer. She's arguably one of the best singers in the 20th century. Her amazing contralto voice started in Europe, but then started to become a sensation in the United States as well. People who got to witness her 1939 performance at the Lincoln Memorial would be sure to tell you that when they hear her voice, they hear freedom ring. Marian Anderson helped create motivation in the civil rights movement. She triumphantly exposed the Daughters of the American Revolution to be a racist organization after being denied the opportunity to sing at the Constitution Hall. After tragic denial, she was given an opportunity to perform at the Lincoln Memorial. Marian Anderson was the most influential woman in the civil rights movement and helped to create motivation that would not have been started without her. During an interview with Stephen Lawson, he said that during the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, several African Americans occupied positions in his administration. This is significant because the previous Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, had instituted racial segregation throughout the federal government. By making black appointments, Roosevelt signaled a shift in Democratic Party politics. One of Roosevelt's greatest assets with respect to African Americans was his wife Eleanor. She had close ties to various African American leaders of civil rights and social justice movements. She played a key role in arranging Marian Anderson's Lincoln Memorial concert and resigning from the DAR. Without her influence within the Roosevelt administration, including with Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, the concert would not have taken place on federal space in Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. was a thoroughly and formally segregated town, right? And so what the Daughters of the American Revolution were saying and doing in barring Marian Anderson openly, really, as a, because she was, as they put it, colored, that was not illegal. It was very much in conformity with the law.
So Marian Anderson, with a crave to perform in the United States for her fans, asked to book the Washington Constitution Hall, but she had been tragically denied. The DAR, also known as the Daughters of the American Revolution, who owns the Constitution Hall, relentlessly denied every attempt she made to book the hall. In an interview with the New York Times, they stated that the DAR says that the only reason Miss Anderson's request was rejected was that the Constitution Hall was already booked for that Easter Sunday by the National Symphony Orchestra. The group acknowledges that its lease for the hall included a white artist-only restriction, but insists that because of the prior commitment, the restrictive clause had no bearing on the rejection. But it in fact played a huge role in the tragic denial. Black artists were permitted to use the hall in its early days. The DAR says the restriction was added in the early 1930s to comply with a universal practice among Washington theater operators, but it appears that Miss Anderson's request was refused not by the board of the DAR, but by Fred E. Hand, who throughout the 1930s was the organization's manager of the Constitution Hall. In an interview, Patrick Hayes, who from 1941 to 1947 was manager of the National Symphony Orchestra, said that in 1941, Hand had indicated to him that he alone was responsible for having prevented Miss Anderson from singing at the hall. He told me that from the time the hall opened in 1930, people from all races were allowed to perform there, said Mr. Hayes. The choir from Hampton Institute, a black college in Hampton, Virginia, performed there, and Roland Hayes, the famous black tenor, sang there too. At one of Roland Hayes' recitals, Patrick Hayes recalled Hand telling him the singer noticed a group of blacks bunched at one side of the auditorium and mistakenly concluded that the management had segregated the audience by race. Actually, Hand told Mr. Hayes a block of tickets had been sold to a Black Alumni Association. Nonetheless, Roland Hayes announced from the stage that he would not sing until the audience was desegregated. Hand said he stood in the center aisle to prevent any movement by the audience, and since nobody wanted to cause a commotion, everybody froze. Finally, Roland Hayes gave his performance, but even so, Hand was furious and made up his mind not to allow another black to appear at Constitution Hall as long as he remained the manager. The current President General of the DAR, Wayne G. Blair, said that even though a white artist-only policy was enforced at the hall when Miss Anderson's representatives were turned away, race had nothing to do with the decision. Miss Blair points to an advertisement from a 1938 issue of the DAR magazine showing that the hall had already been booked for that date by the National Symphony Orchestra. On the other hand, both Mr. Hayes and Stuart Warkow, a former house manager at Carnegie Hall, said that the rationale was irrelevant since major auditoriums like Constitution Hall often presented more than one attraction on a busy Sunday. After being turned down for the April 9th date, Herrick writes he instructed an assistant to request a series of alternate dates in April. Adding to that recollection, Mr. Hayes said in a recent interview that he had heard from him that each time the Herrick office suggested a new date, the hall manager asked who the artist was, and each time he was told Marian Anderson, he replied, "Sorry, that date is taken." Herrick then asked Marx Levine, another artist representative with whom he was friendly, to apply for the two dates Marian Anderson had been denied. When the application was made, Herrick writes, Hand said that both dates were available. Hearing this, Herrick continues, he immediately applied for the open dates in behalf of Miss Anderson. And when he received the reply, it said, the hall is not available for a concert by Miss Anderson. In an interview conducted with a DAR archivist, she concluded, I cannot speak for the organization as a whole, but with the information I'm knowledgeable in, we know that the DAR chose to uphold a Constitution Hall policy at the time that allowed white artists only to perform. But I think that Marian Anderson helped to be a catalyst for a lot of people, including DAR members, to start thinking about racial inequality and what might need to be done to begin the process of change. So the DAR had successfully performed an act of segregation and tragically denied Marian Anderson the opportunity to perform. But when members of the DAR heard about how Marian Anderson had been denied the opportunity to sing at the Constitution Hall, many were livid and resigned from the DAR. But the most notable and surprising resignation was by Franklin D. Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt.
First, that Eleanor Roosevelt was arguably the most influential First Lady in American history, certainly in modern times. And she was very much an activist. So Eleanor Roosevelt had limits to what she could do. But we know that even before the episode with Marian Anderson, she had been active in promoting black rights and opposing segregation. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. So when the DAR refused permission for Marian Anderson to perform at Constitution Hall, Eleanor Roosevelt resigned. She was one of hundreds, possibly thousands, who resigned. But of course, she was the most famous. And again, her resignation had the greatest symbolic import. And then she went beyond that. She worked with Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior, who was an important aide to Franklin Roosevelt, and who had formerly been the head of the Chicago branch of the NAACP, to arrange for Marian Anderson to give a concert at the Lincoln Memorial.
Eleanor Roosevelt gave Marian Anderson an opportunity she could not turn down. She was given the chance to show her talent at the Lincoln Memorial.
Genius that Marian Anderson should raise her voice in tribute to the noble Lincoln, whom mankind will ever honor. Miss Marian Anderson.
During this performance, Marian Anderson showed extreme patriotism to the country she loved. But in her glory, she also triumphantly exposed the Daughters of the American Revolution to be a racist organization because of their spurious accusations to why she couldn't perform at the Constitution Hall. She showed the United States that segregation was not the way us fellow Americans should act. She is one of the most prominent women in the civil rights movement, and after her performance went on to continue to advertise for the civil rights movement. Marian Anderson still lives on, and thanks to her tragic ways the African American performers were treated, has become no more.